I want to thank you, first of all, for those who have stayed. It's been a long day, and I know that people are itching to go home, so I'm going to try and keep within my time limits and hopefully give you time to ask some questions and participate in this last panel. I'm a little bit disappointed that Barbara Hall has left the hall, because I think that there are things that will come out of this discussion that she probably would need to hear or should be listening to as the Chief Commissioner. Anyway, we'll discuss that another day. So we've already heard that Dan and Donna Hill moved to Toronto in the 50s and that they were an interracial couple, which was very difficult, both in the States and here at that time. But with work and determination, they were able to make it work, and they were also an inspiration to others. When they came to Canada, particularly in Ontario, there was already activism going on. And I would say activism was the order of the day. We've heard names already today, but I'm going to throw some more out, some of the same names as well. Bromley Armstrong, Kalman Kaplansky, Harry Gary, Stan Grizel, and others who were already here fighting for justice and fairness for racialized groups and for workers. Bromley Armstrong and Dennis McDermott were from the United Auto Workers. Kalman Kaplansky was from the Jewish Congress and the Jewish Labor Committee. Gordon Milling, some of you might know his daughter, from the Steelworkers. Stan Grizel, Harry Gary from the sleeping car, the porters. And of course, Dan and Donna Hill. And we also heard that the instigator at the very beginning of this process wasn't Dan Hill, but Donna. We know that women kind of agitate and instigate and try and get things done, and other people kind of follow along. But all of those people did something to make sure that all of our lives, all of us sitting in this room, our lives were a lot better. Their work eventually led to the passing of the first human rights legislation, firstly in Ontario and then followed by other provinces and then federally. All of these people that I've named and others subjected themselves to humiliation and degradation. They put themselves through hell and had the nerve to publicize the discrimination that they faced. Why did they do that? Well, to make the case for proper legislation and to make Canada a better place in which to live. One would think, knowing what we hear about Canada when we go overseas, that this very caring society that we call Canada would be sympathetic. Instead, the opposite was experienced. There was resentment and ostracizing for those who took on these fights. They were labeled as troublemakers. Well, for those who know me, troublemakers are good in my book. And I think it's important that we need to stir the pot sometimes to make sure that the correct things get done. And despite being negatively labeled, there were still a determined group of people, led by the labor movement, who campaigned for effective human rights legislation. The rationale for labor's concern was issued in a fact sheet that became the grandparent of all the harassment and discrimination statements that are usually now read or cited at the beginning of most labor events or activities. And I'll read part of it for you. And those who are in the labor movement can sort of think about what they hear now and see how closely it resembles the statements that we read. Discrimination and prejudice split the union. They are a threat to unity. Discrimination and prejudice are in direct conflict with the underlying principles of the labor movement, which are brotherhood and equality, brotherhood and sisterhood. When some citizens are deprived of their rights, everyone's rights are threatened. If we believe that equality is fundamental to democracy, then those who violate this principle should be punished. Law is a moral force on the community and puts teeth into the democratic principle. It is a most effective means of education. Now, in my book, instead of all the harassment statements that we read now, we could have just kept that one, which was from late 1940s, early 1950s, and we would have been fine. We didn't really need to reinvent the wheel. Anyway, all across the country, labor committees for human rights were being formed with the task of protecting members and assisting unions with protecting their membership from discrimination and seeking remedies against discrimination areas outside the scope of collective bargaining. These committees were responsible to the Labour Councils, which is still the community arm of the Canadian Labour Congress. They had the task of changing, and we heard this earlier today, hundreds of years of injustice and discriminatory behavior. This was the work that Bromley Armstrong, Dan and Donna Hill, and many, many others were involved with. They investigated and documented cases of racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination in employment, housing, and other services. They publicized their findings, and this forced both the Ontario government and society to act. The government of the day took on the issue of human rights reluctantly after the Second World War. And those of us who are in the labor movement knows that still, government and labor will only move when you force them or shame them into moving. It's the same thing. There were many changes to human rights and equity during that time. Amendments to the Labor Relations Act that affected collective agreements. However, the amendments still did not make it illegal for trade unions or employers to discriminate. Therefore, there was still much work to be done. Criminal code, criminal code, criminal code. In the 1950s, the government of the day in Ontario created a number of equity laws, including Canada's first Fair Employment Practices Act, making it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, creed, color, nationality, ancestry, or place of origin, in accordance, which was already said with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As well, there could be no discrimination in union membership, something that the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cart Porters fought very hard for. They actually formed their own union when they were not allowed to join the existing unions because the White Brothers barred them. The first pay equity law was also instituted around this time, all because of the work that had been done by Dan and Donna Hill and many others. And you heard that this morning with Lawrence's presentation, and also the clip that you heard of Donna. She didn't really think that she didn't realize that what she was doing was actually forcing changes to pay equity, because as far as she knew, there wasn't an inequity until she heard about it later on. They also worked to force government to enact a provincial fair accommodation practices law. Legislation and codes were piecemeal across the country, and in 1960s, full-time staff was finally hired to enforce legislation and provide public education in Ontario. And among the full-time staff we've heard was the first full-time director, Dr. Daniel Hill. He was at the helm when very significant changes was made and put in place. And I believe that by everything you've heard today, everything you've read about him, the things that he did really influenced government to move. While all of this was happening, labor was being forced to take care of its own house. Unions were being called to task by organizations like the Sleeping Car Porters. Led by Harry Gary and Stan Grizel, the Porters were trying to change the structure of the labor movement by showing them that they needed to change their own practices and structures in order to do away with their own discriminatory and racist practices. The labor movement continued to organize for human rights legislation and fight against discrimination based on race, color, creed, and nationality until the late 60s and early 70s, when some of those labor human rights committees stopped being active. In deference to community organizations, unions became more involved with other social issues concerning women's rights, seniors, and disability issues. Racism was still on the agenda of some unions, such as my own, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and the Ontario Federation of Labour. CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, we like to use acronyms, which are really not cool these days, and OPSU, which is the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, began creating policy and writing courses on human rights in the late 70s and 80s. They talked earlier today about the services for working people that Dan set up, and that, again, was helpful to the processes. It actually forced unions to do what they were supposed to be doing, because now there was outside groups. There was the services for working people, and there were also workers' centers that were set up outside the unions, basically saying to the unions, you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing in terms of protecting workers, so we were going to do it elsewhere. So again, it forced them to act. In 1984, 3 significant things happened at the Canadian Labour Congress. It was the first year that the Congress officially commemorated the Day of Mourning, which is the day that we commemorate workers injured or killed on the job. The second thing was that the Congress finally adopted a statement urging our affiliates to fight for stronger human rights legislation and to push for employment equity. Significant because 26 years later, the movement is still fighting for employment equity. and an end to racist practices. We have great policies on paper where employment equity is concerned, and we do a fantastic job demanding that employers and governments implement employment equity. However, we're still very, very slow to enact similar practices in our own house. Report cards have been issued by the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and other labor organizations. We issued report cards in the 1990s and recent ones in 2005, 2008, which indicate there is so much work still to be done within the labor movement around the issues of discrimination, employment equity, and racism. The third significant event in 1984 was that the Canadian Labour Congress awarded Dan and Donna with a humanitarian award for their activism on human rights. In accepting the award, Donna Hill spoke about a group of activists that helped to shape human rights in Canada. She described them as young and optimistic activists who believed the issues of bigotry and discrimination could be solved. She said all that was needed was to persuade governments to pass good legislation. She was talking about herself and her husband and Bromley and all those others. And yes, they were very, very optimistic. Similar to all of us when we start into a movement and we think we can make change immediately, and then we realize, I was about to swear, so we realize, darn, the bureaucratic BS won't allow us to make those changes as quickly as we want. Well, I think they did succeed. They succeeded in getting legislation passed and administration set up to administer the various programs across the country. However, in 1984, due to economic hardship, there were setbacks, and she expressed her concerns that as a result, despite all the work that had been done, they were heading back to square one. After 1984, it would take much work on the part of the Labour and the larger coalition, and I think at that point, we finally realized we had to work more closely with coalitions and continue that work and not give up when we thought that we got something that we were fighting for. So we worked in a larger coalition made up of community activists, faith-based organizations, women's organizations, and others who wanted to see a fairer society to continue the work that had begun in the 1940s. It would not be an easy task, and with much opposition coming from within the ranks of the labor movement, but we still needed to do the work. By the 1990s, Labour and their coalition partners were instrumental in forcing governments to adopt legislation around same-sex benefits and other human rights legislation. There was also movement within the trade unions to change the way that they operated. Anti-harassment and anti-discrimination clauses in collective agreements, seats for workers of color and Aboriginal workers, human rights committees, workers of color and Aboriginal working groups, and conferences dedicated to human rights were all being fought for and implemented. In Ontario at the time, there were structures in place to deal with a number of human rights issues, including a ministry devoted to Aboriginal issues, an office which focused on disability issues. We already had the Anti-Racism Secretariat, we had the Women's Secretariat, we had one other. Can't remember right now, but NDP also passed employment equity legislation during that time, and we established an Employment Equity Commission. In the 1990s, I believe, and there are others out there that believe, that Ontario was well placed with government institutions to ensure equity and inclusion. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Hill a number of times. However, the most memorable was in 1978. As a youth member of the National Black Coalition of Canada, I was asked to sit on a panel chaired by Hamlin Grange to speak about issues of racism facing young people in the education system. I remember being so excited, for although I had seen Dr. Hill before at various events that I attended with my mother, in 1978, he was no longer Dr. Hill, my mother's boss and colleague, but rather the other Dan Hill's father. And tell me which young girl at the time wasn't swooning over, sometimes when we touch. I knew at the time that the work that he and others were doing was important, but it wasn't until I was much older that I realized the road that they had paved, a road that allows me to stand before you today, a road that allows all of us to be in this room today and tell our stories. This morning, Dan sang a song, about his dad, and about him being missing in action at times and not being there at times. A number of us in this room went through that, and it's important to know that we went through that so that we could be here today, so that I could stand before you today, so that Lawrence could be writing today, so that Dan could still be singing today. And at the time, we didn't realize that, but we realize it now. And it is so, so important. So that song will stay with me, because I know that my mother wasn't around a lot. She was on those picket lines and in those human rights meetings and writing employment equity legislation to make life better for all of us. And it's emotional because I have two young boys, and they ask me the same questions. They have complained, Mom, you're not here, you're at meetings, and I try to tell them that it's because I'm out there trying to make life better for you. And all of you know the heck that we go through as racialized people, as people of color, when we decide to do the work that we do. And there are times we want to quit, we want to give up, we want to say to hell with it all. My second year as executive vice president, my 11-year-old son said something to me that I will take with me everywhere I go, every single time I feel like giving up, every single time I feel that this is not worth it. I was ready to quit. We go through discrimination, harassment, no matter who we are, no matter what position we're in. And my little son looked at me and said, Mommy, you can't quit. You taught us not to be quitters. Aren't you doing this for us? And I remember that every time I feel like giving up, and every time somebody, particularly a woman of color, comes to me and says, I can't do this anymore, I don't want to do it anymore. That's important to remember. That's the legacy that your mother and your father has left with us, and my mother and all the other elders who have gone before us have left with us. And I think that we need to hold on to that and hold on to that dearly. So there's my little emotional rant. Dan Hill made sure all of Canada knew the importance of Blacks in Canada. He used his voice and talents to ensure that everybody knew the role that Canada and Canadian society played during and after slavery. He ensured that our history was preserved by founding the Ontario Black History Society, and did his best to show all, particularly young people, their worth and contribution to Canada. I am here today because men and women like my mother, Beverly Johnson, like Bromley Armstrong, Rosemary Brown, June Vreecock, the Braithwaites, George Brown, Stan Grizel, Wilson Head, Dr. John Brooks, Wilson Head, Dr. and Donna Hill, and many, many others believed in human rights, but also believed that we should tell our own stories and we should stand up proud. Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, so much has changed in the area of labor and human rights since Dan and Donna Hill came to Canada in the 1950s. So much has changed for the better, but so much has also been lost. Erosions of our rights in Ontario since the Harris years has seen the dismantling of institutions that the Hills and others fought hard to establish. More recently, the closing of the Ontario Human Rights Commission offices and the arrival of tribunals that don't have the same education, investigation, and enforcement powers that were fought for in the 1940s to the 1970s. I'm definitely in favor of the commission. Karen talked about the two sides. I'm definitely in favor of the commission model because I believe that that worked. It just needed some more resources. People didn't go through the struggles that they went through, to go through the humiliation that they went through to put something in place to have it totally dismantled, particularly when it was working. Federally, we've seen equality programs and human rights structures lost, status of women offices closed, the court challenges program gone, closures and changes at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, defunding of women's and human rights organizations that do advocacy and education, and the whole issue of systemic discrimination, whole other topic for a totally different day, but it's still there and it's still alive and it needs to be dealt with. In Ontario and across the country, we are fighting many of the same battles. As marginalized communities, we have to fight to make our voices heard. Today, we need that same commitment and dedication to activism that the Hills embody to fight to regain what we have lost. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, yes, we need to get back to basics, but not just around legislation. with education, organizing, and agitation. Frankly, those tactics that Dr. Hill and Alan Borovoy and Bromley Armstrong used so many years ago, we need to get back there. And just before I finish and close, I want to make a shameless plug for a conference that's happening December 8th to 11th. It's happening in Ottawa, but it's around the dismantling of human rights and what we need to do in terms of getting politically active. It is a conference that's being put on by the Canadian Labour Congress, but I'm plugging it because it's the first time that we're having a conference not just for union members, but also for community activists to sit together in a room and figure out where we need to go, what strategies we need to use. That's the back to basics I think we need to get back to. We need to talk to each other, work together to make sure that human rights, everything that was fought for in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we get back and more. Thank you.